Hello, and welcome to an SLA Europe Wednesday webinar. I'm Megan Price, SLA Europe board member and events newsletter coordinator. Thanks for joining us. We've had over 120 people sign up for this event, and we're happy to have you here with us. Today we have immediate SLA past president Hal Kirkwood with us to talk about mind mapping, tools and concepts. So before I present our speaker, I'd like to make you aware of our Padlet. And our Padlet, you'll be able to ask questions and make comments. I've just put that link into the chat box for you. So you can click on that, ask questions, post comments, and it also has links to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Hal Kirkwood. He's SLA's immediate past president. He's also a Bodleian business librarian in the Sainsbury Library at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. He's also an accomplished author and experienced conference speaker. So tonight, Hal is going to speak with us about mind mapping for about 45 minutes. And after that, he'll be taking your questions.
Okay, so hi, everybody. My name is Hal Kirkwood. I'm the current Bodleian business librarian at the University of Oxford. And over this next 45 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is just give you an introduction into what mind mapping and concept mapping is all about. My plan is to go over a little bit of a background of these concepts, compare the two, mind mapping and concept mapping, to each other a little bit, and then delve into the core basic elements of a good mind map, a good concept map, look at some of the uses, and highlight a selection of tools just to kind of show you what's out there and what I look for when I look for a tool to do this type of thing. And along the way, I'll have hopefully at least several examples that will come into play so that you'll get an idea of how it can be used, how I've used it in specific situations. Before I start to work through this Prezi, a couple of things I want to bring up. One, if you are motion sickness, if you have motion sickness at all, you'll want to look away a little bit as I transition from screen to screen. Prezi is a sliding presentation tool, so there'll be some zooming back and forth and in and out a little bit. And I know some people find that a little nauseating. That is not my intention as part of this presentation. So just be aware of that you may want to glance away from the screen. Now, what's the point of all of this? The point of this is, with mind mapping and concept mapping, it is a method of training your brain a little differently to take in information, process it, analyze it, and regurgitate it in such a way that, especially for yourself, you start to develop a deeper understanding of what the focus of the map is all about. It is designed to help you sort of collate and connect information that you've gathered, information that you've learned, but also at the same time potentially helping you to see more visually and more descriptively potentially new knowledge that you may not have realized that your brain has started to create connections to. Now, in this regard of these two, of mind mapping and concept mapping, this is inevitably more complicated than what I'm going to be covering today. There is a lot of research into this, several books. I'll mention that, some of these off and on, and especially at the end. So the key elements of this really are in a bigger, deeper concept is brain mechanisms and knowledge organization. And that's where there's just not enough time to really dive deeply into those two concepts in such a controlled environment like this. What's the why of mind mapping and concepting? The concept mapping, there are several core elements. One is improved learning. It starts to pull you away from the historic list making and rote learning, and pushes you more towards something that is more dynamic and connects with a variety of different aspects that your brain naturally connects to. It is better for many people, better for note taking and note making in general. So whether you're at an event like this, listening to someone give a presentation, it is possible to use mind mapping and concept mapping to create a much richer page of notes based off of what you're hearing in your own knowledge set, as opposed to just trying to scribble down everything that the speaker has said. It can be used for the evaluation of learning, and there are numerous examples. It's actually one of the examples of how this started out originally. The idea of concept mapping was developed to determine how much a learning disabled child had learned, given this more dynamic, more creative level of taking notes, transferring knowledge down onto paper or onto a Word document or into a tool or something like that, that you can assess how that person grasps what the core ideas were, what the tangents and the subtopics are, by how they describe and write this all out. So it can, within that context, be used to overcome misconceptions. Because if someone starts to draw or map out something that is not how certain ideas are connected, you'll be able to see it within the design and the development of their map, where if you had asked them or interviewed them, you might not have been able to ask the right questions to elicit the answer that really shows they're not quite getting what the concepts were you were trying to get across, because they're potentially just trying to give you the answer that you want. Whereas mind maps and concept maps are inherently very personal, based on the information that you're building into it and then your own knowledge that you're layering into it as well. So these are really designed to open up your creativity and to break away from linear thinking. So the three key elements are: you need to think differently, broadly, and conceptually. You want to challenge yourself to generate similar types of ideas, similar types of concepts, and then variations of those as you work through mapping that focal point that you've started with. You want to try and be as broad thinking as you can, extending the scope of where you could potentially go, depending on that focus or the underlying problem or question that's built into the map that you're designing. And then conceptually, you want to take into consideration very concrete elements as well as very theoretical elements, and see how those develop and where they go, to then watch for the patterns and the connections that come out. And I'm gonna peek at that for just a second. And as I had said before, I'm not going to want to be thinking linearly at all with this. Now, there are all kinds of examples of this in nature, of this nonlinear perspective, of this idea of key focal points that branch off into other elements. And you can see this in a variety of different places, from the spider web that starts at that central point, sending the guide wires out in this circular pattern, and then the cross connections that move through it. You have something like the feathers of the peacock that radiate out from the body of it. This is an interesting visual representation of how information can be viewed in a different way. You have the lowly dandelion, the weed that infects all of our yards, all of our gardens here in the UK. And again, there's that concept of key ideas and then tangents and subtopics that branch off of it. From dandelions to undersea coral plants and animals to banyan trees, you see this sort of framework of development, of branching off, of interconnections and support across each other over and over again. Chemical structures, as well as DNA elements as well. You see these same facets that come in. And you can then see how even in the presentation from the scientists that created this, you start to see elements of color and variation that we will talk about a little bit later. Now, before I get to the examples, I'm going to stop for just a second and give a little bit of background on mind mapping and concept mapping. Both of these concepts, mind mapping and concept mapping, roughly began in the early 1970s, at least as they're studied and considered now. Mind mapping was developed by basically two brothers, Tony and Barry Buzan. And it was really their desire to get a grasp on learning how to learn. The story that one of the brothers always tells is they went into their college library and asked the librarian, I want a book on how my brain works. And the librarian pointed them over to like the medical texts. And he was like, no, not to like see it and to operate on it. I want to know how do I make my brain work better? You know, and at that point they were told, well, there isn't really a book that does that. So this then developed into this rolling concept of using key focal points, subtopics, color, images, and combining them into a visual representation of a person's conceptual perspective of that core idea. They very much keyed on this concept of radiant thinking. Don't start at A to B to C. Start with A and go to B, and also go to M, and go to 4, and go to sound and something else, to really sort of explore and push the parameters of your ability, your thinking process when you're looking at that core idea. Concept mapping was effectively being developed at almost the same time in the early 1970s by a researcher named Joseph Novak. And he was specifically working with small kids who were struggling with different learning abilities that they had. And it was really based on this concept of the assimilation of new concepts, the sort of perceptions and the connecting into the existing frameworks that the learner already had. It very much keyed on cognitive structures to a certain one. It's less visually attractive than mind mapping, as you'll see in the examples in a little bit. Those are some of the key differences, but functionally they're very much the same. There's that level of learning and evaluation tool. There's the ability to overcome those misconceptions, and there is the elements of developing and refreshing and potentially reorganizing the connections in your brain to get a deeper understanding of the concept that you're mapping. So in this example right here, this is a more pure concept map on the idea of high blood pressure. And you know, a quick look at, you can see there specific elements of organs and symptoms, and then symptoms based off of specific types of stresses that take place. And This is sort of a solid, clean, and unstructured concept map because of the variety of flow and the interconnections between. I'll explain structured and unstructured a little bit more later on. There we go, sorry. Here is actually a concept map about concept maps, highlighting a variety of tools, talking about the different benefits. You again start to see certain elements that are common to good maps that we'll cover more specifically. But I just want to kind of keep moving through some of these examples so that you can start to get at least a mental model for what I'm talking about. Now here we're actually starting to delve more into a mind map versus those first two that were concept maps. Mind maps are clearly much more personal because you're adding in drawings, elements, images that might mean something to you and may not mean anything to someone that you show this to. The developer of this mind map, showed partnership as a small group of people on a little boat. Key milestones of teaching and learning were both shown as small trains moving off in some direction. So, whoever designed this probably had some idea in their mind that these two are similar in that conceptually for them it made sense to show them as a train chugging along out into the future of their development into teaching and leadership, but they each had their own core elements, the train cars built into it. And you see this all the way across. So this one, the mind maps tend to be much richer as far as color, design, and imagery is concerned. And you don't have to be a good artist. That is not a prerequisite to mind mapping at all. If you understand what it is you've drawn, then you're good to go. Another one that is a bit of a mix of concept and mind map, you are again seeing some imagery that has built into this that helps you immediately look not just for the headers, the labels on the branches, but you also, your brain connects with those pictures for current affairs, political issues, the briefcase for business, so that you can potentially get into that section to delve deeper into it quicker, refresh your brain a little more energetically, a little more creatively, to understand where you were going with this concept and then what it then does for you for what you're trying to understand as far as the whole concept of literature is concerned. And again, here's another one. Lots of images, years thrown in, and even though they're constrained here with this, the core idea being the 60s, you can easily see that something like a branch out off to 1965 could become a massively huge branch of additional ideas and events and concepts and movies and songs, so that even though in the hierarchy of this mind map, it is out as a smaller branch down into the map, that doesn't necessarily limit the potential for that to expand into a much broader, deeper, more detailed area of the map if you so choose to go that far and explore it even deeper. In general, there are some core elements, and we'll look at it here and then we'll see it again as I move into the next section. There are labels. Labels for the conceptual ideas and the subtopics. There are also labels for the connections as well. Now, some tools allow this, some don't. So that's something to be aware of, is depending on how you are developing your mind map or your concept map, that can be an extra layer of information that is built into it. Depending on the tool that you use, you may or may not be able to have that extra layer there, along with these branches and the nodes. Okay, so I'm going to jump over here. And actually, before I get to the key factors, let's actually jump to a quick specific example. So here's an example that if you wanted to, you could actually try and do for yourself right now. You could grab a piece of paper, grab a pencil, a pen, or a marker, and as your focal point, write happiness right in the middle. And what we're going to do is start to develop a mind map of our individual unique perception of what happiness is. Now, I had grabbed this and, not too long ago had taken a minute or two to build this out just to see where I would get. So I very quickly threw down 3 new nodes, 3 branches off: freedom, love, and money. That for me, the concept of happiness potentially connects to these 3 ideas. Now, if I had taken more time, I could have easily created additional primary nodes linking away from happiness, if I give myself more time to think about it. But what you can also see is that I'm at least very subtly starting to put in a little bit of imagery as well. The little heart, symbols for different types of cash. I'm also intentionally using color so that I can easily and visually see the different sort of groupings of different areas. And as I mentioned earlier, you can go from something very concrete like money to something very theoretical like freedom. And if I were to then go one more level, I took another 2 minutes and went out even farther to talk about and to map out the concept of, well, happiness involves laughter for me, and it involves my understanding of happiness as it relates to freedom means that I can travel. And for myself and many people right now, we really feel a lack of freedom in this current situation where many of us are locked down because of the pandemic. So we're not as happy as we usually are because the freedoms down that branch are constrained at this point. Freedom for me, happiness and freedom for me is biking. When the weather's nice, I go out and take long bike rides. I didn't need to write the word bicycle. I could just throw a little picture down of a bicycle. I know what that means to me. The same thing with music, and then the actual tool that I use, the iPod that I have. And yes, I'm still an old school iPod user. Over here on the love side, it starts to branch out into the people that I know, my wife and kids, friends that I have. And then you can see that I have a cross connection from one node to another, where I'm happy when I'm laughing and having a good time with my friends, even if it's in a Zoom call and we're all hanging out, at least seeing each other and connecting and strengthening those relationships that we have. So in just a few minutes, you can see you can take something like happiness and expand it into a variety of different areas to map your own perceptions and your own understanding of what it means to you and what you could then potentially do with it, explore from there. So now I will hide this and come back here. So the key elements of this, the key factors, are emphasis, clarity, and association. Emphasis is built in as you identify the core secondary layer of nodes and giving them a certain level of importance and strength, and that they have enough depth for themselves generally to allow for you to explore deeper down into the map. You also can use color, font size, bolding in some way to show off and strengthen the emphasis of specific elements of this. with the clarity, especially when you compare mind map to concept mapping is set up so that you might have a word or a phrase in each node that branches out. Mind mapping, the emphasis there from Tony Buzan and his development of it is you should try and get it down to as few words or a single word if possible. So there's a certain not just clarity but simplicity to it as you look at it and expand it out. And that if you're using more than maybe 2 words, you probably should just be breaking those up into even smaller branches and nodes. There is then association, and that's where the connections become important, explaining what the relevance is or what the influence is between the associations from one node through a branch down to the next node. So when looking at these design elements, to have effective concept maps, to have effective mind maps, you want to tap into that creativity that I mentioned before. Use variations of size, words, lines, shapes, the thickness of the lines. Use color in some way, but don't get bogged down by the color. Use it in a way that makes sense to you. Group it in a way that's visually appealing and connective to your own minds, your own mind, your own ideas, your own perceptions. There is a lot of research that shows that words combined with color actually improves retention. So highlighting certain words throughout your entire map in certain colors can potentially help those concepts, those ideas jump out, which then helps you develop potentially new knowledge, because you're starting to see these elements that maybe you didn't see if everything was just black and white and everything looked the same and the emphasis was the same. There was no differences between these. So that the elements of words, images, color increases the potential understanding and the recollection, especially when you start to develop a map on an idea, a problem, or a concept that you come back to later on. And that's a very important aspect of mind maps and concept maps, is that they should never be in any way static. At some point in time, you should almost always go back and revisit older maps that you created. If they're in an electronic format, you can refresh them with new learning that you've experienced, with new issues and situations that have arisen. If it's on paper, keep the old one handy, but start a new one and see how things have changed in your mind, in your memory, as you redevelop that map again with however much time or however many events and new information that has come into play for you. And then use those arrows, that direction, to show those connections. The other key elements are to work around that central idea and make sure it's focused enough for what you're trying to map or for the problem at hand that you're not overwhelming yourself. Use smaller terms so that you don't constrain any of the expansion. Don't allow a branch to get to a point where you look at it and go, that branch can't go anywhere anymore. There should always be some opportunity to continue branching and adding nodes farther and farther out if you so desire, if there's a purpose for that. You want to think in hierarchies and categories, and then start to watch for how the spacing of these hierarchies and categories works with each other as the map develops. And that's where those cross-map connections can really become very relevant as you start to see and develop a deeper understanding. And as I just said in the last little bubble, revisit and revise these maps. So uses. They can be used in a lot of different ways. The list here is a good example, a good list of examples for self-analysis. As I had said in the little example at the beginning, an evaluation of understanding. Just creative thinking and brainstorming, either alone or with a group. It allows for everyone to potentially easily bring their own perceptions, their own skill set, their own knowledge to the table and show what they know and start to see how their knowledge and perception of things connects with others. And specifically, I've used this in classes. So for example, I taught a hospitality and tourism management information strategies class back at Purdue. And early in the class, the first couple of class sessions, I would go up to the board and put up something like the word tourism, and then tell the class, okay, draw a connection, what, create a branch, draw a node, what do you think tourism means? And we would spend 15, 20 minutes exploring this, watching how these students had their own perception and watching how they reacted to their fellow students' perceptions. And you could see, even in just a simple exercise, they were already starting to learn things. That their concept of what they thought they knew was expanding because they had to share the development of this map with other students who had their own perceptions, their own experiences that impacted the map. So lots of different examples that can be used here. And actually, so here's another variation of an example that I did. I have used concept mapping for resource finding. So back when I was at Purdue, and it's something I've carried with me, so I'm working on it here at Oxford as well. I developed what I called information ecosystems. And these are concept maps. And let's see if this will load right. These are concept maps. This one specifically is on company information. The central focus is companies. And what I'm trying to show students who are trying to find information is companies can be found in profiles and directories. And then this map actually lets me launch into selected databases that we subscribe to. Companies create financial data. And then for public companies, it ends up in a certain location. For private companies, you get it from another source. They create white papers as well. So from this map, a student can visualize this conceptual ecosystem of information connected to their search for companies. What we found is that especially certain types of students connect to this very strongly. While I was at Purdue with this, one of the areas that we worked with was we taught engineering students how to take their ideas and develop them into a business plan. Well, these are engineering students had very little concept of business and the underlying business facets of creating a business plan and understanding markets and corporate finances and funding and everything like that. So showing them a map like this to help them get to the information that they want and why it's important, what it does for them. Okay, companies are analyzed by investment analyst reports, and they contain things like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, etc. They immediately connected to this. The feedback we got was overwhelmingly positive about how easily it was for them to figure out what they needed to look at and how to find it. Versus what many libraries have are libguides, which tend to be just lists of databases with descriptions of what's in that database. That's not always an effective way to help direct students to those sources. They get overwhelmed. It becomes white noise in effect. So this was another example of this as well. And this was exactly where I was talking about with the hospitality activity. So I got a little ahead of myself. I will click on through. Now, as far as publications, there's a lot of work and research on this. This is a very, very short list of just some key articles. There's the book written by Tony and Barry Buzan. Joseph Novak and his Theoretical Origins is a more recent article about concept maps, but he has several that go back decades with all of this. The concept mapping that I was starting to do with using business information specifically and using it within my classes and using it within web design to direct students to. I wrote an article about that. So that's another one that you can go take a look at. Other librarians, some Canadian librarians wrote about how they use concept mapping in a variety of different ways. So this is just a short little list of elements. So that's the basics, the elements, the uses, you know, in a broad stroked overview of this. What we're going to do is dive in and take just a quick look at a couple of the tools that are there. But tools, lots and lots of tools. There are so many different options to choose from. There are questions you want to ask and investigate when you start to look at these. Do you want one that's web-based or do you want one that's software-based? There are some that are both or one or the other. How well do they handle graphics and images? How easy is it to use? And are you looking for something that is easy and convenient to help you build maps? Or are you looking for something that is maybe a little more complicated because it gives you more control over it? And then the shareability. Is it a tool that is used more personally, or are these maps that you can serve out across the web, share with others to collaboratively work on? And all of these have different elements. So just to take a peek at just a couple of these. So Drawio is a very good one. It is completely free. It comes with a variety of shapes and graphics built into it. So it's leaning a little more towards the mind mapping side as opposed to the concept mapping side. It allows for hyperlinks, which can be important. It allows for documents linked into the map to give it greater depth to link out to. And then also it's unstructured. And what I mean by unstructured, and I'd mentioned that before, is as you start to build the map, you place the core elements and you literally have to draw the lines and the connections and make every element connect to every other element however you desire. There's no underlying control by the software. So let me just back out here like this, and we'll then take a peek at Coggle. Now, Coggle has a free and a fee version. The fee-based version gives you more options, more maps, more images. This one tends to be very limited in its shapes. This is much more on the concept mapping side when comparing the two than Drawio that we looked at. It does allow for cross-map linking. Many do not, and for me, I find that frustrating. What I also struggle with some of these is that the node and the branches sometimes can and can't be labeled. My preference is always to find one where the branch can actually be labeled as well as the end node, because it allows me to put in that greater level of depth that I had talked about earlier. But now this one, Coggle, is a structured mapping tool. And what I mean by that is, with this core little idea, I can click this arrow and it will automatically sprout off a branch with a little curve built in that I can manipulate a little bit. The same thing with the related idea. I can click on this and then have it automatically branch off. It sort of sets a more rigid framework to it. There's less flexibility. I will jump back one more time. And we're at about the 45, 46 minute mark. I could spend, you know, the next hour going in and out of these different tools. Definitely explore them. The link that I put in, the bit.ly link to this Prezi will always be available to anyone who wants to come back to it and explore it and look at these. At this point, I will just show the one that I tend to use the most, that my examples were for, was CMap. This is a software-based mapping tool. It's completely free, limited in shape, so it's more concept than mind mapping. Does cross-map linking, does hyperlinks. It's unstructured. It allows for labels to be linked. It allows for hyperlinks and documents to be connected to it. And it has its own free server that the group IHMC runs, so that you can post your map out on the server and it's live on the web, and you can then link to it. So there's a whole free server level to this as well, which I like a lot. And ask, are there any questions?
Thanks, Hal. That was great. Yeah, there's a lot of questions on the Padlet. I'm just going to read them out to you, okay?
Okay.
So the first one, or a good one, I think, is that this person's not sure they understand the difference between a concept map and a mind map. And is it a big difference, and does it matter?
No, it doesn't matter. The difference from my perspective, the difference is that the mind map tends to be much more visually oriented, much more graphically oriented, and thus inherently much more personal. Whereas the concept map is tied a little bit more, is tied solely around the words, the text, the textual ideas that you're putting into it. Whereas, you know, if I were to go back to the beginning of this, to the examples to show the mind maps examples that I showed, those ones are just really rich with, you know, drawings and characters and all kinds of little elements in it that would potentially be interesting to show to other people, but might not inherently connect to them, because it's your visualizations that you're putting into a mind map. Whereas a concept map is, I think, a better tool to use when you're not the only one that's going to be looking at it, that you're going to share it to someone else and you want them to get what you're trying to show. So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. So what has been your biggest wow using mind mapping when you first started? And
I think the biggest wow was when I started to experiment with this and thought it would just be sort of an interesting way to highlight and direct students to our databases. So that map that I showed that I created at Purdue, and I had created 3 or 4 different variations, industries, companies, a couple of others, and you know, in my head, and I've got some rough examples that I'm working on of taking those elements and connecting them to each other for like a big mega map, is when it became obvious certain types of students that what they were studying, they connected with the map much better. Like business students already had their own sort of mental models of business information and how it is connected and how it works. You know, accounting and companies and markets and international business. They've been living it much longer, so they get it on their own. When we showed this and threw this at the engineering students, you know, prior to this, they just struggled over and over with they struggled with trying to pick the right database. They struggled with trying to get the information that their engineering professors were asking them to go get. And as we started to develop these maps, we would get feedback from students, which, you know, you often don't get, is really positive feedback from students completely spontaneously saying, this map totally saved me so much time. I understand why I'm doing this and where to get it from, and I'm piecing it in, and my project is so much better than it would have been. That was probably one of the earliest like wows of working with this idea.
so initially there was some pushback from some of the students. They were a bit skeptical, but then once they got started, they were big fans.
Yeah, and there still are some students who they'll go in and look at it and go, stupid lines and bubbles, I don't get it, just give me a list. Just give me a list that I can pick things from. Okay, if that's how you function, I can't change that.
No, I was just going to say, if there's a way to, is there a way to transition those more linear thinkers into this mode of thinking? Is there like a step they can take that can help them see the benefits?
Yeah, potentially. It usually takes time. So, if you can get in front of a student, if it's a student who comes in for help, and you can sit down with them, show them, here's a list of our databases, here's our companies, but let me show you this map and walk them through it, then they start to understand what they're seeing. And it then doesn't overwhelm them like it does for some students, where they, again, just see all these little words and lines and bubbles and they don't understand what they should do with it. Even just that little bit of explanation of, here's your core idea, and then these little branches give you directions to go in. What direction do you need to go in? And they're like, oh, well, this is for my accounting class. I need to get financials. Okay, see how this leads you down this branch to these nodes that explain and then give you the links to the databases that will give you that financial data. You can see the little light bulbs that start to go on. Oh, okay, I get it now.
Nice. So when you think about accessibility and perhaps students that have special needs, did you find this to be an effective tool as well? And how did it work with some of the accessibility software, the things that people use to?
Yeah, I don't have a really good answer for that. I know some are more accessible than others, but that is certainly a challenge when looking at the different software packages and the elements that they offer. So yeah, I guess for that, it's a good question. I don't have a really good answer for that one. It's an issue you have to be aware of, especially the ones that are more visually oriented. If you're building in a mind map that you're sharing with,
and then I have a question. If you have students that are in front of you now, all of students have laptops in front of them and they're all busily typing away. Is there a place for this in the classroom when students are taking notes? Can we pull them away from their laptops and move them more towards this way of note taking?
I'm not against students doing things on their laptops while I teach. If it's a situation where I want them to develop a concept map, conceivably with several of these different software applications, I could have them create an account, log in to a free web-based version, and have them on their laptops say, okay, we're going to go over this topic for the next half an hour. Take your notes using this tool. And then at the end of the class, have them save a version of it and send that to me so that I can see what did they get out of it. I can then look across the class at all of the maps that have been turned in and realize, oh, this one core idea that I thought I was perfectly clear explaining and teaching, 80% of the class just clearly didn't get that they mapped it. It's completely stunted. There's no depth there. And I thought I was giving all kinds of depth that they should have been getting. The other element with some of these, it allows for collaborative mapping at the same time. Prezi is one, and there's at least a couple of others. So you then can break the groups. You can teach for 20 minutes or so, and then break the students up into small groups, have them log into 5 separate maps, 3 students per map, and have them work together. They're still on their own computers, and they're sitting next to each other, talking about what they're building, what they thought of, and then adding elements to the map, and they can see what each person on their little mini team is building into the map. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this if you're willing to be creative and realize that to a certain extent you're giving some of the instruction up by making the students do this, and you're just roaming the classroom, asking them questions, making little points, to see what are they developing based on what you did teach them, but also what they all heard and learned. And from my perspective, it makes the classroom just a lot of fun.
Yeah,
It completely changes the dynamic of the classroom.
that sounds excellent, Hal. Thank you. That's all the questions that we have for this evening. Thank
Okay.
you for joining us, Hal. Appreciate it. Thank you again for being with us. Please be sure to visit our website and sign up for our newsletter, and we'll see you again soon. So thank you again, Hal.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I hope this was useful. And
Excellent.
don't hesitate to email me if you've got questions or want to follow up with anything.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.